Hello, everyone. My name is R. Baker. I hail from UC Santa Barbara, and I'm here to share with you today my presentation, Mars Rising, Speculative Ecopoetics and Terraforming Futures on the Red Planet. On February 18th, 2021, the Perseverance rover was ready to make its final fiery plunge onto the surface of Mars. Every detail of the descent had been painstakingly mapped, analyzed, simulated, animated, cross-referenced, discussed, and hashed out over years of planning, 9 months of spaceflight, and a projected total cost of $2.8 billion. The countdown began, and tens of millions watching from home held their breath as Perseverance began its descent. The slightest design flaw or ill-timed accident could result in the failure of the entire mission. Finally, after an endless wait, Perseverance beeped a digital thumbs up to NASA. The control room erupted in cheers, social scientists, data technicians, and mission control operators leaping to their feet and whooping with excitement. Percy, as the little rover is fondly known by fans, had landed triumphantly in its new home at the site of an ancient Martian lake bed. We had finally arrived. But who are we, really? The Perseverance rover, like most human attempts throughout history at exploring and mapping terra incognita, is a study in contradictions. Where does exploration for the sake of knowledge end and colonialism begin? Much of the current enthusiasm surrounding human futures on Mars, in both science fiction and speculative science, arises from a seemingly teleological faith in progress as endless expansion. As climate devastation, collapsing biodiversity, and gross social inequality compound on Earth, colonizing Mars begins to look more and more like an attractive escape valve for the ultra-rich, with echoes of the romanticized myth of the frontiersman cowboy, the pioneering white settler who conveniently confuses that which is unknown with that which is empty. From the technocratic dreams of social engineering to fever fantasies of privatizing whole planets in the name of untapped markets, talk of terraforming Mars can all too easily mutate into a capitalist myth of infinite surplus, of leaving the working poor and the global south behind while the rich, as always, absolve themselves of consequences. And yet, I argue that this reading of the Perseverance mission is too quick, too pessimistic. For those of us concerned with environmental and social justice, it's often all too easy to simply dismiss such endeavors as inherently hegemonic, big spending that benefits only a privileged few, which our current state of planetary crisis can ill afford. But like it or not, here we are. Coming from the other direction, then, consider the fact that one of Percy's primary missions is the search for evidence of astrobiological life. If found, the sheer fact of alien life would present an existential challenge to Western anthropocentric assumptions, a decentering of the human rivaling that of Darwin or Copernicus. And even in the absence of alien life, the prospect of becoming extraterrestrial ourselves is one that few beyond the realm of science fiction have seriously considered. Mars, with its frigid temperatures, poisonous atmosphere, and massive atmospheric radiation, is not amenable to Terran life. In order to survive there, we would rely absolutely on the synergy of biology and technology, closed-loop systems and biomes engineered at unprecedented levels of both scale and finesse. What might be the outcome of constructing homes, planting crops, and raising families in a truly alien space, where even primal assumptions about the length of a day and the feeling of gravity are fundamentally different? Could this radical shift of milieu be enough to effect a shift of consciousness? An exponentially compounded version of culture shock that sloughs away the ossified layers of cognitive and social heuristics that one comes to think of as inevitable? Could colonizing Mars fail as speculative capital or as a private Elysium, and instead become the site of a truly new social order, space not as a final frontier to be conquered, but as a place for becoming otherwise? Perseverance is thus both the product of settler colonialism and a potential disruptor of this master narrative. As a tool, or even an entity in its own right, it can be read as a site of unfolding potentiality, of futures not yet realized. Taking this analytic crossroads as my starting point, this presentation will begin to trace the work of just a few threads of multifaceted possibilities and questions through utopian science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy. The Mars Trilogy explores the concept of terraforming Mars from myriad scientific and cultural perspectives, asking a series of questions. How might the infrastructure necessary for worlding another planet over the course of centuries shape and be shaped by those who maintain its functions? Air-breathing, warm-blooded bodies, wholly vulnerable within the biotechnical embrace of their tiny ecosystems. And by extension, how might this infrastructural consciousness play out its analog in terms of the social and cultural schemata necessary to human worlds, trade, governance, politics? Within Robinson's grand thought experiment, the physical setting of Mars produces both cognitive estrangement and acts as a novum by asking a crucial question. What might emergent cultures look like in a physical space that depends absolutely on the maintenance and care of fragile, multi-species biosystems? One in which the margin for error is very small indeed, one in which overconsumption and frenetic expansion are both ideologically and ecologically impossible. Might living within this delicate balance of systems, where one always understands oneself in prismatic relation to the whole, where each component is crucial, in turn encourage the development of cultural norms based on maintenance, care, and cooperation, norms fundamentally ecological in nature? As a thought experiment in utopian speculative imaginaries, the Mars trilogy does its utmost to craft a colonization narrative in which human communities don't colonize. Rather, it attempts to imagine the creation rather than the conquering of a world. For the novel's human actors, this means learning to live within strangeness and shape themselves along with their environments, rather than remaking the red planet in Earth's graven image. It's only fair that I acknowledge here my own dearth of scientific expertise in the matter of terraforming and enclosed biosystems. This presentation approaches them as concepts only, organizing infrastructures within Robinson's speculative story world. In the tradition of feminist science and technology studies, Robinson's Mars and its speculative infrastructure is multi-positional, a cyborgian beast that holds myriad and occasionally contradictory discourses in relation to one another. Like the trilogy itself, my examination of these discourses traverses the borders between science and culture, technology and ecology, the human and the non-human. As such, if I am occasionally wrong, it is nevertheless my hope that I may be usefully so. Written in the mid-90s and set between the years 2026 and 2226, the Mars trilogy begins from the premise that it is indeed scientifically possible for humans to settle and eventually terraform Mars, and that Terran powers that be find it financially and politically viable to do so. Over the course of nearly 2,000 pages and 200 diegetic years, the series imagines how such a radical shift of planetary locus and perspective, along with the physical and ecologic infrastructures necessary to sustain life on a frigid, irradiated world, might catalyze a correlative shift of cultural and social consciousness. It's important to note that Robinson's trilogy is not a work of techno-determinist escapism. Rather, it functions more like a rigorous simulation of what could conceivably come to pass, given our current state of affairs, including the axiomatic assumption that late-stage corporate capitalism and its requisite irresponsibility will continue unchecked until hitting an insurmountable crisis point. Science as a force of social good is never elevated to the status of magic within the novels. Similarly, Robinson's work refuses to engage in the convenient erasure of social unrest, bigotry, and climate injustice, of which so much hard and utopian science fiction is unfortunately guilty. Although advanced materials and biosystems technologies are absolutely crucial to humans settling Mars, the ultimate success of this venture is far from inevitable and means different things to different human actors. Rather, the colonists' world-building efforts are the outcome of a series of choices, a struggle hard won across 3 Martian revolutions that fight for and eventually win independence from Earth-based meta-national corporate powers. Nevertheless, the Martians themselves are ripe with intergroup conflict as they engage in their own negotiations about what it means to build a world. Most notably, the conflict centers on the question of terraforming itself. Those in favor are broadly known as the Greens and form the majority of Martian settlers. However, a small but powerful minority, the Reds, are against terraforming efforts of any kind. They see it as nothing less than the worst historical impulses of colonial destruction playing out yet again, but this time on a planetary scale. The red and green positions, like all political affiliations, occur along a nuanced spectrum of moderate to extreme. Importantly, Robinson never robs them of their complexity by vilifying one side or another. He never creates an obvious or easy way forward for the reader. Instead, red and green form the dialectic within which the cultural, political, and infrastructural systems of Mars develop as ecologies rather than linearities or binaries. By their very nature, both incommensurable and irreconcilable, the negotiation between the red and green environmental extremes forms both the central linchpin and thematic backbone of Mars's political evolution, even as it develops into a united revolutionary power that eventually throws off the yoke of Earth's control, but then must learn to govern itself without resorting to tyranny. Sustainable prosperity for the biosphere is no easy feat when there is no pre-existing, self-correcting nature to rely on in the first place. Similarly, the grand progression from enclosed, separate biomes toward a larger planetary ecology is gradual. A terraforming project that includes warming the atmosphere, routing waters into oceans, and engineering DNA. This project finds its analog in a multiplicity of semi-autonomous human collectives. These collectives experiment with mixing and matching systems of governance, traditions, ways of life in much the same way as one would experiment with species and terrain in emergent ecosystems. These collectives, some brought together through ethnic heritage, some by political or religious systems, some by love of science, others through the desire to recreate ancient ways of life, strive at once toward complexity and sustainability. However, sustainability cannot occur in isolation, since even the most advanced closed-loop ecosystems are asymptotic in nature. In other words, some resources are always lost, misused, or over and underproduced. Therefore, the economic base of Robinson's Mars, just like its politics, is also ecological in nature. It takes balanced cooperation rather than ruthless competition as its primary heuristic. Intra-community imbalances are corrected by inter-community trade and mutual aid, manifesting as a gift economy in which the goal of trade on the part of both parties is to give more than you receive. This in turn makes aggressive theft or bullying, the practice of might makes right, not just culturally unacceptable to Martian communities, it's also eminently illogical. Such behavior trades short-term gain for long-term stability by squandering the goodwill and expertise of one's neighbors. It's a framework of coexistence that synthesizes rather than homogenizes. Like all balanced ecologies, this necessarily means that the limits of acceptable difference also come into play. Individual freedoms are balanced with the rights of the collective, the prosperity of the present with the conservation of the future. Totalizing discourses and demagogues that focus on winning at all costs are destructive and dangerous because failure to account for secondary effects is simply not an option. Thus, although ultimately it is the Greens who prevail on the question of terraforming, the red position, post-independence, continues to act as an important counterbalance against rampant consumption and expansion, a crucial cornerstone to Martian governance. The environmental court becomes the highest law, and private ownership of land is as expressly forbidden as that of human beings, all in an attempt to make impossible the base conditions that, taken to their logical conclusion, have together catalyzed our current moment of planetary crisis on Earth. The infrastructure of building adaptive, creative worlds from a series of closed-loop biome ecosystems thus laces itself together in the novels from the labor and visions of multiple ways of being, speculative futures, and biotechnological innovations, even occasional retrogressions, all occurring alongside maintenance, care, and repair as cultural norms. This mindset is necessarily disinclined to totalities and master strategies, preferring tactical mixing and matching, bits and pieces, the creative salvage of many parts and many pasts working in tandem. Appropriately then, Independence from Earth is not the narrative climax of the story. The third and final book in the series deals with the slow work of governance, of balancing ecosystems, red and green ideologies, and experimental communities across a nascent biosphere whose human lifeways are as diverse as its species and biomes. Its future remains uncertain. Appropriate to the overall theme of ecopoesis, the series does not end so much as it fades out. Mars does not arrive. Terraforming is ongoing. Governing bodies shift and change. Biomes may yet fall into disequilibrium. But for now, at this moment, there is a pause, a balance, and a cautiously optimistic hope for the future. I return here to the Perseverance rover as an analytic crossroads of speculative futures on Mars. In its cleverly designed PR campaign, Percy is often portrayed as a plucky yet humble explorer, venturing bravely alone into the red wastes. But here again, we encounter a tension, a paradox. The little rover is not a single entity at all, but a collection of semi-autonomous systems, each designed to serve a different but complementary function. Carefully balanced, designed with resilience, adaptive self-maintenance, and unforeseen eventualities in mind, Percy is Legion, a mechanical synergy that serves as metaphor for the speculative ecopoetics of Robinson's utopian imaginaries, a robotic wayfarer carrying a seed of disruptive potentiality, even within an apparently textbook example of settler colonialism in space. Of course, it could be otherwise for those of a dystopian turn of mind. It can always be otherwise. But for all of its tendencies toward quixotic audacity, I believe that we do a disservice to utopian thinking if we reject it entirely. It's easier to imagine capitalist extraction and colonial greed ad infinitum beyond the boundaries of a ravaged earth, a hellish eternal return to ecologic despair, than it is to imagine those same technological systems and infrastructures being reclaimed in the service of anti-hegemonic futurity, of critical hope. Utopia for Robinson is a praxis that must be maintained and repaired like infrastructure itself, whose goalposts move along with its evolution. Robinson's Mars is a world where the negotiation between differences is retooled as productive rather than destructive, a world ever in the process of becoming. Mars becomes cognitive estrangement and critical distance, and it provides this distance as a critical first step on the continuum of the possible. But in the end, all this has little or nothing to do with Mars itself. The building of better worlds, in space or otherwise, must begin with our feet firmly planted on the Earth. Thank you very much.